My name is Eleanor Wright. I'm 34 years old. And the moment my marriage quietly started ending didn't involve shouting or slammed doors. It happened during a dinner with friends when my husband leaned closer to me, lowered his voice slightly, and said something that sounded small in the moment but changed the way I saw everything. "You're making this awkward." That's what he said. Calmly. Almost politely. Like he was correcting a social mistake. At the table, everyone else kept talking, laughing, passing around glasses of wine, unaware that something in our marriage had just shifted. I looked at him for a second, confused. Because all I had done was ask a simple question. One normal question. Why didn't you tell me you invited her? Her being a woman from his office who suddenly appeared at the dinner table that night. A woman I had heard about once or twice but had never actually met before. He didn't answer the question. Instead he leaned closer and repeated it under his breath. "Eleanor, you're making this awkward." The strange thing about that sentence is that it wasn't really about awkwardness. It was about control. Because when someone labels your discomfort as awkward, what they're really saying is that your feelings are inconvenient. We had been married for 6 years. From the outside our life looked stable, even successful. He worked in corporate management, the kind of career that made people assume confidence and competence. I worked from home as a software consultant, which meant most days I managed my own schedule while keeping our life organized behind the scenes. Our evenings had routines. Dinner together. Casual conversations. A show before bed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing broken. At least that's what I believed for a long time. But over the last few months something had changed in ways that were easy to ignore if you wanted to keep the peace. He started coming home later. His phone stayed face down more often. Conversations became shorter. If I asked about his day, I got summaries instead of stories. I noticed all of it. I just didn't confront it. Because sometimes you tell yourself that relationships go through quiet phases. Stress, deadlines, temporary distance. You convince yourself patience is the same thing as understanding. But sitting at that dinner table, hearing him whisper that I was making things awkward, something inside me went very still. Not angry. Not emotional. Just clear. Because suddenly I understood the real rule he expected me to follow. Don't ask questions. Don't create discomfort. Smile, stay quiet, and let things happen around you. That night, for the first time in a long time, I decided I wasn't going to follow that rule anymore. The rest of that dinner continued like nothing unusual had happened. People laughed. Glasses clinked. Stories moved around the table like normal. But the moment he said those words, something in my attention changed. I started observing instead of participating. The woman from his office sat 2 seats away from him, smiling easily, speaking confidently like she had been part of the group for a long time. He laughed at her jokes in a way that felt slightly different from how he laughed at everyone else. Not inappropriate. Not obvious. Just attentive. And suddenly the last few months made more sense than they had before. The late nights at work. The phone that never left his hand. The short answers whenever I asked simple questions. I didn't accuse him. I didn't create a scene at the table. If anything, I became quieter. Not upset. Just watchful. When dinner finally ended and everyone began putting on coats near the door, she smiled at me politely. "It was really nice meeting you," she said. "I've heard a lot about you." I returned the smile. "I'm sure you have." My husband looked between us quickly, like he was checking the temperature of the room. On the drive home he stayed unusually relaxed, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting casually on the center console. "You were a little intense tonight," he said after a few minutes. "Intense?" I asked calmly. "When you asked about the invitation," he said. "You put everyone in an awkward position." I looked out the window for a moment before answering. I asked a normal question. He sighed. "Not in front of everyone." That sentence sat quietly between us in the car. Because what he really meant was simple. Questions are fine, as long as nobody else hears them. When we got home, he dropped his keys on the table and headed straight for the kitchen to grab a drink. I followed more slowly. So next time, he said, pouring water into a glass, if something bothers you, just talk to me privately. I watched him carefully. You mean quietly? He frowned slightly. What's the difference? I held his gaze for a second before answering. Quiet conversations are usually the ones where nothing actually changes. The next morning the apartment felt unusually quiet. Not tense, not hostile. Just careful. My husband left early for work like he usually did, but before he walked out the door he paused in the hallway. Let's not turn last night into something bigger than it was, he said casually while putting on his jacket. I looked up from my laptop. Bigger than what? He hesitated for a moment. An awkward moment, he said. That's all it was. I nodded slowly, as if I agreed. Of course. He seemed satisfied with that answer and left. But the moment the door closed behind him, I realized something important. That sentence wasn't meant to resolve anything. It was meant to close the subject permanently. Don't think about it. Don't question it. Move on. For years I had been very good at doing exactly that. Ignoring small things for the sake of peace. Explaining away behavior that didn't quite make sense. Convincing myself that patience was maturity. He wanted comfort. Later that afternoon he sent me a casual message. Dinner tonight? Just 2 words. No mention of the night before. No curiosity about how I felt. Just routine continuing like nothing had happened. I stared at the message for a moment before replying. Sure. That evening he came home around 7. I was sitting at the kitchen table working on my laptop. What do you want to eat? He asked, dropping his bag by the door. Normally that question meant I would start cooking. But instead I closed my laptop and stood up. I already ate, I said calmly. He blinked. You did? Yes. He looked confused for a second. Without me? I met his eyes. You weren't here. The silence that followed was small, but noticeable. You could have waited, he said. I tilted my head slightly. Why? He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. And for the first time since that dinner, I saw something different in his expression. Not irritation. Not confidence. Uncertainty. For the next few days, nothing dramatic happened. There were no arguments, no accusations, no emotional confrontations. I didn't bring up the dinner again, and he didn't either. On the surface, everything looked normal. But the routine between us had quietly changed. I stopped automatically organizing our life around him. Small things at first. I made coffee for myself instead of 2 cups. I stopped asking what time he would be home. When weekends came, I made plans with friends instead of waiting for him to decide what we would do. None of it was aggressive. None of it was meant to provoke a reaction. I was simply removing the invisible work I had been doing for years without realizing it. By Thursday evening, he finally noticed the difference clearly enough to say something. I was sitting on the couch reading when he walked into the living room and stood there for a moment watching me. You've been acting strange lately, he said. I marked my page and looked up. Strange how? He shrugged, clearly trying to explain something he hadn't fully thought through. You're distant. I considered that word carefully. Distant. That was interesting, because distance had been building in our marriage long before I stopped cooking dinner or waiting for him at the table. I'm not distant, I said calmly. I'm just not rearranging everything around you anymore. His eyebrows pulled together slightly. What does that mean? I closed my book. It means when something feels uncomfortable, I'm not pretending it doesn't exist. The room went quiet again. He shifted his weight, looking uneasy in a way I hadn't seen before. So this is about that dinner? He asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I watched him for a moment, letting the silence stretch long enough to make the point clear. Then I said something very simple. No, he blinked. No? I nodded slowly. This is about everything. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there for a few seconds, as if trying to understand a conversation he hadn't expected to have. Everything, he repeated quietly. I nodded. Yes. He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he had whenever he felt cornered. I don't understand why you're making this such a big deal, he said. Nothing actually happened. That sentence almost made me smile, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. It was the same logic people use when they want something uncomfortable to disappear. G exploded, then nothing was wrong. If there was no shouting, then there was no problem. But relationships rarely break because of one loud moment, they break because of hundreds of quiet ones that slowly change how two people see each other. I leaned back against the couch and looked at him calmly. Something did happen, I said. You told me my feelings were inconvenient. He opened his mouth immediately. That's not what I meant. I know, I said. But that's what you said. The room went still again. He walked toward the kitchen counter and leaned against it, thinking. You're overanalyzing one awkward moment, he insisted. I shook my head slightly. No. I'm finally paying attention. He frowned, clearly uncomfortable with where the conversation was going. So what exactly do you want from me? He asked. It wasn't an angry question. It was a tired one. I thought about that for a moment before answering. Clarity, I said simply. About what? I held his gaze. About whether we're actually partners, or just two people living in the same house because it's convenient. For the first time since the conversation started, he didn't answer right away. He looked down at the kitchen counter, fingers tapping lightly against the surface like he was buying time. Of course we're partners, he said finally, but the words sounded more automatic than certain. I watched him carefully. Then why did it feel like my feelings were a problem? He exhaled slowly, clearly frustrated now. Because you were making the situation uncomfortable, he replied. I nodded once, almost thoughtfully. Exactly. He frowned. Exactly what? I stood up from the couch and walked to the kitchen, stopping a few feet away from him. You weren't worried about the problem, I said calmly. You were worried about the discomfort. His expression tightened. Those are the same thing. No, I said quietly. They're not. The silence between us stretched again. I could see the moment he realized the conversation wasn't going back to normal. You're acting like I did something terrible, he said defensively. I didn't cheat. I didn't lie. I just didn't want an awkward scene. I studied his face for a second before answering. And that's the problem.